Hey everybody, it's Tony Codispoti from Grey Vocal Majority, and today I want to talk to you about a very serious topic. America, the legitimacy of its founding and its principles, are under a full frontal assault by left-wing extremists inside and aligned with the Democratic Party. The character of a number of these attacks has been along lines of race and ethnic identity, focusing primarily on a distorted view of history of slavery in the United States. This leftist insurgency is trying to use any connection with the practice of slavery among the founders and framers as a way of nullifying their contributions to liberty and freedom. By narrowing their focus, they want to fool Americans into believing their country was illegitimately founded by greedy white supremacist slaveholders, capitalizing on the fact that the last two generations of Americans have been miseducated about American history. The Marxist left is now actively deconstructing America and the symbols of its past. It's going to get a lot worse, too, unless Americans of conscience, goodwill, candor, and intelligence stand up and make it stop. Now, recent polling shows there's reason to hope. More than 60% of Americans believe monuments to historical figures of the Confederacy, for example, which have been a controversy at this point, that they should remain in place. And the extreme left has been demanding the removal of these monuments in large measure because of their connection to slavery. But the fact that 60+% of Americans needs to be activated and motivated to stand up to this effort to render the American founding as illegitimate, this isn't going to happen by itself, even though most Americans don't want to see these things happen. In this presentation, I plan to expose the practice of slavery in a way you probably have not seen it exposed. My intention here is not to do what leftists do and fill your head with propaganda and bite-sized talking points. Rather, my goal is to depict for you what the world looked like in terms of slavery and the fight to abolish it around the time of the American founding, and what the institution of slavery looks like today. Yes, I said today. Understanding all of this in its fullest context will give us the opportunity to more properly evaluate where America went wrong and where it went right, and why America today leads the world against slavery in all of its various manifestations. We would be well served to begin by asking several questions. First, were there any countries in the world that had slavery other than the United States at the time of the American founding? You know, you would get the idea that America was the only country that had slaves. Second, and perhaps the better question is, are there any countries in the world where slavery never existed? And finally, are there any countries where slavery exists today? Now, since this presentation is an examination of slavery over the past several centuries up to the present day, let's be clear about how slavery will be defined here. The definition of slavery as it existed in America is often limited to the capture, kidnapping, and importation of Africans to be used as forced labor. Now, certainly, that is part of the definition, but not entirely. Many of America's first white settlers were indentured servants. Now, in order to receive passage to America, which was very expensive at the time, the indentured servant agreed to work for up to 7 years to pay for their passage to America. This wasn't considered slavery by standards of the 17th century, but in our current day, if something like that were to occur, it would be considered a form of slavery. Blacks initially came to America not as slaves, but as indentured servants. Many people don't know that. It wasn't until 1641 that their rights began to get curtailed and taken away, and there was a shift to racial slavery. Today, concepts such as human trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, forced or servile marriage, and the sale and exploitation of children are considered modern forms of slavery. Modern slavery refers to situations of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or leave because of threats, violence, coercion, abuse of power, or deception with treatment akin to a farm animal. Leftists love to flog America over its past history of slavery and racial inequality, but the United States is the only country to have ever fought a war which resulted in the ending of slavery. The bloodiest war in its history, as a matter of fact. No country on earth has paid as high a price in blood, where at the other end of that war, millions of human beings were freed from bondage. Now, I want to dispel some myths. One myth promoted by leftist extremists is that the framers of the Constitution did nothing to address slavery and counted black people and slaves as only 3/5 human. There is a mixture of fact, fiction, and outright lie here. Let me go through it for you. First, it is true that the original Constitution only counted slaves as 3/5 of a person, but this was a compromise position that has some interesting aspects to it. Slaveholding states wanted slaves to be counted fully so that their state's representation in Congress would be higher and better protect the institution of slavery itself. Opponents of slavery were the ones who argued that if slaveholding states didn't consider slaves to be anything more than property, that they shouldn't be counted at all. So they compromised at 3/5. So who was fighting for the slaves and who wasn't? It's a fiction that the founders and the framers didn't wrestle with the institution of slavery at all. The abolitionist movement was in full motion all throughout the British Empire, and many of the American founders were abolitionists. Half of the colonies had already either abolished slavery or would soon abolish it before the 19th century even began. So to say that the founders didn't wrestle with it is just plain false. The southern slaveholding states would not have agreed to independence, much less a constitution, if it torpedoed their economic system, which was largely based on slavery. Now, what is never discussed is the action the framers of the Constitution actually did take against slavery. Abolitionists believed that slavery needed to be done away with in stages. First, to end the slave trade. That would halt the kidnapping and inhuman conditions suffered by slaves, many of whom did not survive the transatlantic voyage. Now, if you look at the Constitution, the current-day Constitution, Article 1, Section 9 says, which was adopted in 1787, it places a sunset provision on the importation of persons. In fact, on March 2nd, 1807, President Thomas Jefferson signed a bill into law prohibiting the importation of slaves into America, which became effective on January 1st, 1808. At the very same time in Great Britain, through the tireless efforts of William Wilberforce, the slave trade was ended throughout the British Empire. This is important to point out because the extreme left in America completely ignores this aspect of the true history of the abolitionists here and in Great Britain, because it doesn't fit their agenda, which is to deconstruct history. In Great Britain, William Wilberforce relentlessly fought to eliminate slavery. Just days before he died, the British Parliament ended the institution of slavery itself throughout the British Empire. Now, the institution of slavery continued in the United States, of course, until the Civil War. The American struggle with slavery was complicated by our westward expansion. As each territory opened up, battles over whether the territory would be free or slave would occur. The secession of the southern states to form the Confederacy was in anticipation of Lincoln's policies toward slavery in the new territories and states. Slave states believed without expanding slavery, they would be isolated and ultimately marginalized, and slavery would ultimately be abolished, and their economies would therefore be destroyed. This, however, is not a conversation about the causes of the Civil War. Rather, this is about slavery in America and the world. And the fact remains that the Civil War ended slavery in America. Americans since the founding thought slavery to be reprehensible, an atrocity against human beings. But the left has no deeply held moral objection to the institution of slavery. Rather, they see the history of slavery and racial domination as a political opportunity to be employed as part of an overall strategy using racial divisions and victimization in a gambit whose object is purely the acquisition of political power. At first glance, this may appear to be a controversial assertion, but using history as a guide, it can be easily demonstrated. Now, I've taken the first step already by clarifying certain aspects of the American founding and the abolitionist movement in both America and Great Britain. Leftists, though, pretend slavery existed nowhere else worthy of any mention from them. But it is a historical fact that slavery has existed on every continent and in every country, all throughout history, and even today. Now, this should make every American question anyone who seeks to dismiss our founders and framers as nothing more than slaveholders. They were far more than slaveholders. They were learned men who created a republic that was sufficiently strong enough to tackle the issue of slavery. This was true for all of the European imperialist countries as well. And while most of abolished slavery in the middle of the 19th century, slavery continued everywhere else in the world and still does. This fact alone underscores the total lack of honesty displayed by left-wing politics in the United States and elsewhere. They have completely ignored slavery as a continuing problem. While the institution of slavery was made illegal by most of European countries, that did not end the practice. According to the Walk Free Foundation, nearly 46 million people are held and exploited through some form of slavery today. Today. While 58% of these 21st century slaves can be found in just 5 countries, and those countries being India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Uzbekistan, slavery still exists in very large numbers in all of the countries from which slaves were brought to America. The countries with the lowest prevalence of modern slavery by proportion of their population are Luxembourg, Ireland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Austria, the United States, Belgium, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Every one of those countries are either European or settled by Europeans. But the left attacks Europeans for specifically their history of slavery. It has been estimated that a total of only 388,000 Africans were brought to America as slaves. And did you know that the slaves brought to America represent only 3.6% of all African slaves brought to the Western Hemisphere by Europeans? Great Britain sent 1.2 million Africans as slaves to Jamaica. Portugal sent an astonishing 4.8 million slaves to Brazil. The British colonies, which later became known as the Antebellum South, was just a tiny fraction of the total slavery issue in the Western Hemisphere during that historical epoch. Yet the United States is just relentlessly beaten down for the history of slavery in this country. Today, according to the Walk Free Foundation, more slaves are being held in African nations where America's slaves originated than ever came to America. Half of all African slaves in America originated in regions which today comprise about 8 countries: Senegal, Gambia, Angola, both countries with the name Congo, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, and Mali. If the political left, which feigns outrage against the despicable practice we call slavery, if they were truly concerned about that, they would be doing something about the nearly 46 million human beings being held in some form of bondage instead of tearing down war monuments and defaming great men like Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln. They would be organizing for better enforcement of basic human rights and dignity in all 162 nations in the world where slavery still exists. But it's not their agenda. Their agenda is to tear down America, which is just one of a handful of countries that I just named, all of which are part of Western European Christian civilization, where actual slavery has been all but eradicated. Leftist politics generally promotes enslavement. Now, what is enslavement and how does it differ from slavery? Enslavement is not slavery, we should be clear about that, but complete and often involuntary dependency on an external power like government, which acts in control of your personal liberty. And that's what leftists promote. In the United States, leftists have promoted policies which over the past century have served to enslave entire massive numbers of people into a cycle of government dependence. In the early 1960s, they targeted American blacks who were disproportionately poor and disenfranchised. Like a wolf in sheep's clothing, these government programs are masked as relief from poverty. But what they really amounted to was a bribe for votes for the same leftist Democrats who just a few years earlier were burning crosses, lynching blacks, and holding Klan rallies. The same Democrats who blocked schoolhouse doorways from allowing blacks to enter. The same Democrats who demanded segregation now, segregation forever. The same Democrats who deny black families the right to send their children to the school of their choice. The same Democrats who used fire hoses and attack dogs on peaceful civil rights demonstrators. The Democratic Party didn't transform itself from a racist party to the party of civil rights. The Democratic Party only transformed itself in how it applied its racism. Gone are the burning crosses and Klan rallies. Now it's subjugation by way of government program. The Democratic Party divides people along lines of race, class, gender, and sexual orientation, but especially race. The Democratic Party has balkanized America. It's all about divide and conquer, folks. Misinform Americans of their true history, splinter Americans into tribes, alienate them from each other, aggrieve each group endlessly, slander and defame the founders, shame them out of having any pride in America. This is what the left does, and this is what the left is doing. The Democratic Party in America is the center of the universe of leftist thinking. They no longer hold any legitimate claim to the label patriot. Not as long as they subscribe to these leftist extremists who carry more than just a whiff of communist Marxist revolutionary. So in America, as hordes of violent, outraged miscreants who haven't been able to adapt themselves to modern American life act out like children rampaging through a tantrum, chanting how racist America is because of its past, remember, if they really did believe in stamping out racism, racial supremacy, and slavery, they would actually go to where it exists and do something about it. But not in America. They don't really feel that way, and they won't do anything about it. That's not what they're about. That isn't what this is about. This is why all Americans of goodwill and conscience need to stand up for their country right now. We need to stand up for our history, both good and bad. Not just the bad, as the leftists will have you believe. We stand up for the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as our founding documents. We cannot allow radical anti-American leftists indoctrinated and radicalized by militant college professors to bum rush this country into a suicidal downward spiral. Now, what can you do? Talk to your representatives. You know, you'd be surprised how they respond to public pressure. If the only people pressuring them, though, are these radicals, they will respond to them. Don't assume your representatives will do the right thing without your pressure. Don't risk that. Too much is at stake. For the great vocal majority, this is Tony Cottaspati. Thanks for listening, and please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thank you.